Welcome to Walking Through the Word for today. We are in verse 19 of John chapter 1, and we're looking at John the Baptist. Now, remember, John the Baptist is not the one who wrote this book. That was the Apostle John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, as he likes to affectionately call himself. John the Baptist, though, had a very important role. We talked about how he was the bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think that the people of Israel certainly suspected that John was unique and different. They recognized that John was some kind of prophet, though there was controversy about it. The religious leaders didn't necessarily want to acknowledge that John was from God, because if they did, they would have put themselves in a bit of a quandary, because John was calling them out for not following the law of God, but also telling them, hey, pay attention, the Messiah is coming, which prompted people to then ask the question, as it says here in verse 19, who are you? Who are you? Who is this man? He was speaking with unusual ways and doing it in strange ways, and he was a voice, certainly crying out from the wilderness, as he calls himself. But they were confused. They're like, well, wait, are you the Messiah? Now, it says very clearly, John says, I am not the Messiah. When they say, okay, well then, are you Elijah? Now, why would they ask if he was Elijah? Well, remember, Elijah didn't actually die. Elijah was carried up in a flaming chariot, and there were several prophecies in the Old Testament that talked about how someone like Elijah would come forth. Sometimes the Israelites actually believed that was going to physically be Elijah. Okay, so John was like, "No, I'm not Elijah. I'm not him come down from heaven. I'm my own person." And then they said, "Well, are you the prophet?" Well, what prophet are they talking about? Because when I read this growing up as a child, I thought, well, yeah, he's the prophet. He's the guy from Malachi that's going to come and proclaim the Messiah. Yeah, that's not the prophet they mean. They're actually talking about in the book of Daniel, there's a prophet mentioned. And he says, no, I'm not that guy from the book of Daniel. Well, then, who are you? He said. And he gives them an answer that actually is very clear as to who he is, but for some reason they can't seem to they can't seem to grasp it. He says, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. As the prophet Isaiah said. He's actually taking two different verses from Isaiah and kind of combining them together. What he's basically saying is, I am the herald. I am the witness, if you will, that is going to proclaim the Messiah is coming. And then they're like, well, then how do you have this authority? Where does this authority come from? You see, the Pharisees were asking this question because for them, they got their authority from their education. And the Levites that were there, they got their authority from, well, the fact that they were born into that family. And they're like, well, how are you? What are you? They actually must not have realized that John was actually born to a Levite. His dad was a priest in the temple, okay? But either way, they said, why are you doing this? Why are you doing these things? You don't have the authority. You're not the Christ. You say you're not Elijah, and you say you're not the guy from Daniel. So then who are you? Why are you doing this? Now we have to understand that John is preparing people, and he's trying to help them understand that the Messiah is coming, and he's using baptism as a symbolic gesture for that, for cleansing and for preparing ourselves. Kind of like we wash, kind of like they would wash before entering into the Holy of Holies in the temple. They would cleanse themselves. It was kind of like a little mini atonement opportunity. And John was trying to help these people understand that Jesus was coming. That Jesus was coming to save and to serve and to help them. The voice crying out in the wilderness to make straight, I'm clearing the path, I'm making the way for the Messiah. Yet they couldn't seem to quite understand that. Even when we see in the next few verses that John points to them and goes, this is the guy, they still don't understand what it is that John really did. You see, John defied their expectations. He defied what they thought God should be doing. They felt like that as the religious leaders, that they had the foremost and best knowledge to look out for the Messiah, that they, if anyone, was going to catch the Messiah, not some guy who was who comes out dressed in skins and eating locusts and honey, a nutso, forgetting that many of the prophets actually had to do very similar things as God called them to do it. But they couldn't recognize what John was because they had their own prideful blinders on. And this is a good word for us. We see God moving everywhere. God is working everywhere in our lives and around us. The question is, do we have our eyes open to be able to see it? Are we able to look and see where God is moving so that we can be a part of it? Or are we stuck in our own comfort, in our own ways, in our own ideas of how God is supposed to behave, that we miss it completely? It's a good challenge and a good word for today. Tomorrow, though, we're going to look at the Lamb of God.